Welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams-Birch, and this podcast, it exists for you. Whether you're a music lover, an educator, a choir member, each week we bring guests to the show to help explore what matters in music. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to the show. Hello, and welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams-Birch, and today we continue our series on how to avoid or deal with or handle or take space when burnout or other type of anxiety creeps in. This is one of those series that was curated by the American Choral Directors Association, ACDA, Standing Committee for Advocacy and Collaboration. And today, this one features Dr. Stephanie Robertson, who is a doctorate of psychology and is such a wonderful and easy to talk to human. Stephanie is married to Dr. Troy Robertson, who you heard in January talk about some specific tools for us as music people to overcome burnout and to take care of ourselves. But today, Stephanie talks specifically about the psychological practices that we can do, and you're going to walk away with not one, not two, not three, but 5 tools that you can use. But don't worry, you don't have to use all of them right away. Stick around to the end for such an inspirational moment as well as the action item to get started on your journey of self-care. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Perform International, and one of the ways that I think I fill my cup in order to give back in our profession is by travel. And Perform International is just a fantastic organization with which to do so. So if you've ever thought about travel, give PI a call, tell them I sent you. They are fabulous, and I will forever be thankful that they make this podcast possible. Today on the podcast, we are talking to Dr. Stephanie Robertson. Hello, Stephanie.
Hey, how are you, Amy?
I'm so excited to talk to you. We have been friends since my master's degree, and you and Troy were at Florida State as Troy was getting his doctorate. Were you also at Florida State at the time?
I was doing my doctorate as well. So it's been 10 years, more than 10 years.
Yes.
It's been a long time.
Yes, it has. We are thriving. I'm so excited about it. I forgot. Yeah, you guys went to school at the same time. What's your doctorate in?
So I have a PhD in psychology. So it's a combined counseling psychology and school psychology PhD. So I'm a licensed psychologist. Texas has this special designation called licensed specialist in school psychology, which allows me to work both independently and at schools. And then I'm a diplomat of the American Board of School Neuropsychology. So I do neuropsychological testing as well.
That's incredible. Okay, so how did you get into the world of psychology?
I say I followed a serpentine course, right? So I was an undergraduate art major. So I majored in art, studio art, was a painter, and was a minor in psychology. So I got involved with this organization, a volunteer organization, and it worked with children who had been sexually abused and helped them advocate for them. Well, it was an advocacy organization for court. And I wanted to be an art therapist, but that was kind of a hard field. So instead I got my master's in counseling, and I worked for 4 years as a high school counselor. So I was a high school counselor in public schools in North Carolina. And then Troy and I both got into Florida State at the same time. So I knew that I wanted to do something a little bit different. So I went ahead and did the PhD in psychology as opposed to counseling. And we wound up kind of taking the position here in Texas. So that's
so cool. So has Tarleton, has being in that area of Texas been what's guided you into what you're doing now?
No, well, it's allowed me to do what I'm doing now.
Okay.
So at Florida State, I was affiliated with a group called the Multidisciplinary Center, and it was a team of faculty members from across the university. So social work, counseling, psychology, and school psychology, all working together to provide services in that rural panhandle area of Florida to families who weren't able to pay for just having a private evaluation or seeking out private services. So always in the back of my mind, that was sort of something that I wanted to pursue or something that I wanted to do. When we first came to Tarleton, I worked mostly with the college population. So I was in the school counseling or the student counseling services department. So I provided counseling services for college students. But when a faculty position came open, I moved over to that with kind of the view of creating my own multidisciplinary center. And so Tarleton has been very good to me in that they've offered a lot of support. And so we have the Center for Child Wellbeing here on campus. And so we are also intentionally multidisciplinary. I have a social worker who works for me, a counselor who works for me, a school psychologist, and then me. And we go out into schools and we provide the different services, the respective services, and then we also provide services here in the clinic. And we train our students. And so this is a training facility as well.
Wow, that is so cool to see something come into fruition that you experienced in your own education, but then you're able to now impact your community with that.
Yeah, it's been great.
I love the collaboration aspect of it. It's not just the advocacy aspect of it is something that you should have a right to have access to, but also that you're collaborating across so many different disciplines within your clinic.
Yeah. It's great because we all kind of have a different view of the mountain. And so it's been really wonderful to collaborate with people who have a different perspective because we all bring something to the table to help the kids that we're serving. So we can staff cases and really serve our families in better ways. I think we're all better together.
Oh, I totally believe we're all better together. And that's kind of how this conversation happened. We were talking about the impact that burnout is having on so many fields, especially in music. And that led to a conversation where someone had attended a session that you and Troy had done together on burnout in the choir world. And Troy so awesomely came on the podcast and talked about that back in January. But you have some really awesome tools for self-care and approaching burnout from a more psychological perspective. So how did you get into that research before we dive into it?
Oh, yeah. So I have taught several different classes. So I teach undergraduate and graduate level courses. And I've over the years, I've applied these concepts in therapy in a variety of ways. And then I teach the concepts as well. So a lot of what we're talking about is practice. And so this is not an area that I'm researching like the effectiveness of these practices. It's really a lot more about there was a president of the American Psychological Association in the 1950s, and I am not going to remember his name, but he charged psychologists with giving psychology away, right? Let's give this away. This knowledge that we have about human behavior and human emotional functioning, give it away to make the world a better place as much as we can. And so that's been a very foundational principle for me. So at every opportunity, I try to give psychology away. And if we can find applications for psychological interventions that we can apply to music teachers or we can apply to other special populations, then I want to make sure that we give it away as much as we can. And so these principles that we put into this presentation first and then the article afterward are kind of tried and true therapeutic interventions, things that I've done with college students, things that I've collaborated with teachers on, things that I've worked on with high school students even. So these are principles that we have pretty good evidence are effective. And so I wanted to make sure that we could give that, give it away if people want the information.
Oh, definitely. And I know, especially this time of season, I'm super thankful that the way my school calendar is meshed, we just started a spring quarter. So there's no chance for burnout in a way because we've just said goodbye to our winter classes and our winter students, and we have all fresh right now. So whereas some people are just now getting into the slump of spring, a little bit more time until we get towards May and concert season, it's all fresh and brand new over here. So these principles I know will come into play for me later in the quarter when everyone else is out on summer and we're still going strong.
Right. Yeah.
So where do we start? Where's the top of the list of principles?
So the first one that we really talk about is this notion of positive psychology. So Martin Seligman and his buddy Csikszentmihalyi, that I've heard it pronounced a million different ways by a million different people, and I've never actually heard him pronounce his name. So we're going to do our best with pronunciation. But they have this notion of positive psychology, and the idea here is we're not going to try to correct deficiencies so much as we are going to build on strengths to create sort of meaningful and creating a life that's meaningful and worth living, right? We want to make sure that we are looking at the good things in our lives and building on the good things in our lives. So the positive psychology has a lot of different principles, but there are some things that I've done in my courses and that I've done with students and I've done with therapy clients that have been really, really effective. So we know, for example, that gratitude journaling, kind of shifting our focus to the things that we're grateful for, the things that are meaningful to us, gratitude journaling in about 4 to 6 weeks. You don't have to do it every day. You don't have to feel pressure to write down the 3 things you're grateful for at the end of every day before you go to sleep, because that kind of creates more pressure. Just a couple of times a week, take a little bit of time and focus your attention mindfully on the things that you're grateful for. 5, 6 things, right? So just a couple of times a week. It's a pretty low effort intervention that has been shown to reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety. Easy peasy.
And you don't have to write it down. You can just think it.
You can think it, but it's better if you do write it down. You just don't have to write it down every single day, right?
Okay, so removing the pressure of a daily expectation and just every so often in that week, a couple times, write it down.
Yeah, just think about it. Another thing that I've done in many of my classes, so I used to do this as an extra credit assignment in classes, and I had such uniform positive feedback about the meaningfulness of this activity that I created it as a mandatory assignment in most of my classes, and that's called a gratitude letter. I don't know if you're familiar with gratitude letters, but a gratitude letter is where you think of somebody who's done something for you that maybe has changed your life for the better, that has maybe been somebody who's changed your trajectory in some way. And it can be a parent, right? That's kind of low-hanging fruit. So usually I try to encourage my students to think a little bit more broadly. But you sit down and you write this person a letter, right? I am grateful to you. You did this thing for me, and this is what it has meant for my life. You just try to keep it to one page. You talk to them about the things that you're grateful for, how they've impacted your life, right? And then the second step, and this requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is hard, but you schedule a time to share that letter with them. Tell them you're grateful for them and that you want to share this information with them. And then you read them the letter, right? In person is best. Sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes we have to do it on telephone or by Zoom. But be open to the experience and sort of pay attention to your reaction, to their reaction, to your reaction, to their reaction, right? So making sure that you're paying attention to that. And that has, and then I have my students reflect on it, which is obviously not a required step if you're just doing it for your own personal edification. But that experience has had really overwhelmingly positive results, right? Because who doesn't want to be told thank you for making a positive impact in somebody's life? It makes me feel awkward to tell people that. I have to open myself up to the vulnerability, but it has strong positive outcomes for both the person who is sharing the letter and the person who's receiving the letter.
So when you've mentioned vulnerability, and when I think vulnerability, I think Brene Brown. I just think of so many different books. What are steps, especially as we're already so vulnerable in a teaching profession, in a music profession, what are some ways that people can access that vulnerability without fear?
It's not easy. And in fact, I don't know that you can access vulnerability without fear. I think we have to sometimes moderate our expectations, right? One of the things that we know about anxiety, for example, is that anxiety is supported by what we call negative reinforcement. So when we avoid an uncomfortable situation, we avoid an uncomfortable stimuli, we're then reinforced for the avoiding behavior, right? And so then the next time we're faced with that uncomfortable situation, it's just a little bit harder to do, right? And then if we escape again, we're reinforced for escaping again, right? So the key, I think, to really accessing your vulnerability is not to try to do it in a way where you're not going to feel scared, because you're going to feel scared, right? It's going to be risky, but the benefits are so great for engaging with humanity in that way, right? Sometimes we don't have good outcomes, but often we really do. It kind of reminds me of one of the other principles that I've talked about in the article, which is the mindful self-compassion, right? So mindful self-compassion was developed by Kristen Neff. She's somebody out of Austin, Texas. And one of the main principles that she talks about is common humanity versus isolation, right? And the reality is that vulnerability, being hard, is part of common humanity, right? My vulnerability feels isolating. It feels personal. It feels like it's insurmountable or unique or special to me, but it's actually part of common humanity. It's part of what brings all of us together. We all have difficulty being vulnerable. We all have suffering in our lives. And if we can sort of tap into that shared humanity, it makes it a little bit easier.
I love that conversation because so often, especially because it's the first couple days of the quarter right now, and students are sharing what they're hoping to get out of a class. And I have a couple classes that are very performance based. And very commonly, the answer is, I have stage fright or I have performance anxiety. And this is such a great way to approach it because it is our common humanity. We all have those nerves bundled up somewhere. Some people show it better than others, but what a great way of looking at it.
Yeah. Yeah. She talks about doing like self-compassion breaks. Kristen Neff does. So she talks about, if you are having a moment of stress, something that's really upsetting you, something that is difficult, a moment of suffering, right? And there are many people, right? I have students who have to do presentations in classes, and like you, they're so anxious and they have all this performance anxiety, right? And one of the things that we can do is to just take a moment when we're stressed, when we're in a difficult situation, when we're suffering, when we're embarrassed, when we've let ourselves down, when we've gotten that bad news, right? Just take a minute and say to yourself out loud, if possible, this is a moment of suffering, right? That taps into mindfulness, recognizing without judgment the moment of suffering, right? Then we say suffering is a part of life, right? We're tapping into that common humanity. The one thing that we know is everybody's going to suffer at some point, right? And what do we do when other people are suffering? We offer them compassion. We offer them kindness. We offer them comfort, right? And so in a self-compassion check, we try to offer that back to ourselves, right? So instead of, oh, you idiot, how could you have embarrassed yourself like that in front of the whole class, right? We say to ourselves, may I be kind to myself in this moment of suffering? That was really embarrassing, right? Label it without judgment and just try to be kind to ourselves. Try to say the things to ourselves that we would say to a loved one, to a student, to a colleague who had a really, really bad day, who had a bad experience. May we be kind to ourselves in the same way we would offer that kindness to other people.
What a great practice, too, because so often you just get in that whirlwind of the moment, but to pause and to say it out loud and acknowledge that was embarrassing. This is a moment of suffering and we're moving on.
Right. Yes. Everybody suffers. That's what happens.
And that's the thing. We all go through crazy stuff. It's the students who come in that are like, how's your day? Oh, I made it to class. And it's just everything is such high anxiety. And you just want to you want to hug them and say, it's okay. You're gonna get through. This is a choice.
Yes, it's going to be all right. Let's breathe through this together.
Yeah, it's just a moment. That's so much. Okay, so we have this whole positive psychology approach. We have our gratitude journaling, which is not mandatory daily. I think that's key.
Right.
We have our gratitude letter, which you don't have to, but you could become vulnerable and share and experience that whole thing. And then we have our mindful self-compassion.
These mindful self-compassion breaks, they're really, really helpful.
Okay, what's next?
Okay. So next, we've also got some principles from cognitive behavior therapy. Okay. So I'm going to try not to put on my lecture professor hat,
That's
right?
okay. We love
Too
this.
much. I'll try to keep this like a little bit short. But one of the main sort of foundational principles for cognitive behavior therapy, and I think a lot of people are familiar with that term, right? Cognitive is our thinking, behavior is our behavior. So CBT, or cognitive behavior therapy, addresses thinking and behaviors, right, in order to address emotions. So a way to think about this, psychologists love triangles and they love ABCs, okay? So there's
Okay.
ABCs in a couple of different theories. But in the cognitive behavior therapy triangle, on each point, you have thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So you have a thoughts point, a feelings point, and a behaviors point. And they have what's called a reciprocal interaction effect with each other, right? So if I push or I pull on my behaviors, it's going to affect my thoughts and my feelings. Or if I push or pull on my thoughts, it's going to affect my feelings and my behaviors, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're looking at in cognitive behavior therapy is addressing things like thoughts and behaviors in order to have an indirect impact on our emotions, right? Our emotion centers are deep on the inside of our brains. They're a little bit more primitive part of our brain than our higher order thinking skills. So they're harder to access, which is why we access our emotions through our thought patterns in cognitive behavior therapy. So one of the things that we can do in CBT, kind of a super quick, is it's called a thought record, right? So in a thought record, you have an activating event. So something that has happened, right? And you'll find that there are some common themes in these different interventions that we're talking about. Something that's happened that's got you upset, right? Like you got jury duty and it's concert week. Okay, so here it is, jury duty on concert week. You don't have time for this, right? This activating event, the jury duty summons, triggers all of these beliefs, right, about the event, which those beliefs, the way we talk to ourselves about it, result in an emotional consequence. So we're talking A, B, C. And so often we go straight from A to C. So straight from the activating event, I got jury duty, to C, I'm spun up and out of control and so mad. How could this happen in my life right now, right? Without recognizing that there's an intermediate step, which is our beliefs about the event or the self-talk we engage in about the activating event. So it might be, I can't believe this. This is ridiculous. How could this happen to me? This is going to be a waste of my life. It's going to be catastrophic, right? I'm not going to get those rehearsals in and it's going to be horrific, right? So we have these things, then that results in the consequence. Well, in this model, we try to dispute some of those beliefs, right? There are some kind of habits of thinking that we have, and they're so common to all humans that these theorists, Aaron Beck is one of them, Albert Ellis is another, they've labeled them, right? And so, for example, catastrophizing, right? This is one of Aaron Beck's cognitive distortions, is that this missing a rehearsal is going to result in the worst concert I've ever given, right? Well, that's catastrophizing. We're predicting the future, but we can't really know that. So we try to dispute that, right? Well, maybe it won't be catastrophic. Maybe it'll be something, right? Or maybe I should just give myself a little self-compassion break. Or maybe I should settle in because this is one of those things that happens in life, right? So we kind of try to dispute some of those beliefs, those intermediate steps in cognitive behavior therapy, to then address the feelings that are associated.
So let's say someone does get jury duty during concert week or whatever. The thought record, do you trace those three steps then? Like, do you trace what the event was and what your thoughts were and what feeling it led to?
Yeah. So this is a very this is a much more therapeutic intervention, right? And so one of the things that we have talked about in the article is making sure that that you kind of for yourself know when you can do self-care, right? Self-help, self-care, and when you need to go, okay, you know what?
I need
I'm not
help.
making the progress that I want to make. I need help. I need to do this. And a therapist can really help somebody go through a thought record and really break down those beliefs, right? Because sometimes
Hmm.
I have to push a little bit in therapy, right? I have to push just a little bit to get people to acknowledge those beliefs because they're sometimes just outside of our awareness. We don't even realize that we're having them. But yeah, so I usually write it in a column, right? So I'll take a sheet of paper and I'll write a column and I'll write A, B, C, D, right?
Yeah.
And so what's the event? What are the things I said to myself about the event? What are my feelings about it? How am I feeling, right? Then I try to come up with some ways to dispute those things that I'm saying to myself. And then I reassess my feelings afterward.
Oh, I like that the D stands for dispute. So you're
Yeah.
disputing what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So often we just spiral ourselves out, and what a great way to unspiral
Mm-hmm.
in the
Again, it's
moment.
all about mindfulness. Like we're really trying to get conversational with our feelings rather than judgmental about our feelings. We're often really, really judgmental. We snap to those judgments really, really quickly, right? And so another component that we talk about is dialectical behavior therapy, right? And that's a much more complicated form of therapy, right? So
Hmm.
I wouldn't be able to lead you really through an intervention, but it's beautiful therapy, right? It
Hmm.
comes from some Buddhist principles, and there are many, many kind of sophisticated components. But one of the things that we talk about in it is emotion acceptance, right? So being open and curious about our emotional reactions instead of judgmental and or reactive to our emotional reactions. What are our emotions trying to tell us about a situation? What's the conversation that's happening that I'm not aware of with my emotions?
And so when you're doing these things, you have these practices that you're giving us, but then it's also the awareness that sometimes those conversations have to be guided by an outside person.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And sometimes that person can be a trusted confidant, a trusted friend, but sometimes it needs to be a professional, especially if you're experiencing things like depression, right? You find it hard to get out of bed, you find that you don't have the energy that you used to have, you're feeling like hopelessness or helplessness in a situation. Those are signs of depression. And those would really benefit from, you really need an interventionist. Like you really need somebody to help you with that. And so sometimes we can rely on trusted confidants, and sometimes we need professionals to help us.
It's also helpful just to hear that it's okay to have all of these feelings and emotions. I think so often, especially in our student populations, something will trigger just off the deep end and they feel like they're the only ones going through it. And you're not. You are not the only one that's getting close to burnout or is experiencing these feelings.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So much of what we kind of internalize is that nobody could really understand this. This situation is so unique to me. My failing is so desperately personal that it's really, really difficult to recognize that common humanity that we all suffer, we all fall short.
I love that common shared humanity. Okay, so we've talked about the cognitive behavior therapy. You gave us a little glimpse into the one I'm not even going to write down because we should do that one with a therapist. What else? What other tools do you have?
So really, the last one that I would kind of really talk a little bit about is just making sure that we're focusing on health, right? Because good health is the foundation for any effective intervention. If I'm not sleeping, then I am not going to be my best self. If I am not eating healthy foods, which is really hard, especially when you're very, very busy, right? Um, I feel worse, right? If I'm not getting some exercise, I feel worse. And so, really acknowledging and paying attention to the fact that good health is the foundation of any positive intervention is so, so, so important. And that requires commitment to health first. And
Mm.
that's hard for a lot of people. but prioritizing my physiological well-being makes me able to serve other people more effectively. So much of the time we think this is a calling, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is this thing that I'm doing, and I do the same thing, right? I'm serving families and children, and if I'm not serving families and children, how am I even, like, what am I doing with my life? It's all a waste if I'm not constantly serving. And that's actually not good for me. And it's not good for the children and families that I'm serving, because, that old adage, you can't pour from an empty cup, it's really true. It's like an adage for a reason, because historically we've seen it over and over and over again. So we have to prioritize our health if any of the things are going to work.
That's so important. And it's interesting. I taught a class last quarter, and one of the days was as singing athletes was the topic of the day, based on this really awesome what a curriculum I was following. Anyway, we did a day of just exploring 10 minutes of all these different types of exercise regimens, whether it was bar or Pilates or yoga or HIIT or stretching or mobility. And the number of students that have come up this quarter to tell me about the new routine they have made that incorporates X, Y, or Z, and just see their face glowing. And then, like, I'm getting up early to do this every day. And I'm like, don't forget to take rest days.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, so we don't really have time probably to go into it a whole lot, but if the Florida State people know about the self-shaping project, right?
Oh,
Where
that's
we're
such a good
engaging.
project.
Yes, where we're engaging behavioral strategies for ourselves. So we're practicing things like changing the context or the antecedent for a behavior, changing our reward structure, figuring out how to make minor changes in our lives. It's a really great behavioral model. But I have had students who've done that, because I've also incorporated that into courses, right? And I had students who had read some research. I had one who read some research on vitamin D deficiency and asthma, like the relationship between those two things. And so she started being very intentional about taking vitamin D supplements and spending time outside. And as a result, wound up cutting back on asthma medication, right?
Whoa.
So these things, like, go outside, be outside. It's good for your body. Like, we have tangibles that show that. We just forget. We get real wrapped up in our days or our time, and we forget.
We do. I mean, you could go outside and get your vitamin D while you're doing your gratitude letter or your mindful self-compassion moment.
Yes,
Those are all times to step outside. I was just at a gig, and during the lunch break, all I wanted was some outside. We had been stuck in this dark auditorium, and it was so much fun. I had no ill wishes of the gig. I just wanted some sunshine.
Sure.
And I walk outside, and 2 seconds later, it starts pouring down rain. But it still felt so good to get the air on your face. Just that little change in the atmosphere around you. And getting outside, because we're so often inside under fluorescent lights. Or in a room with no windows.
All the time. All the time.
So important. Yeah. Oh, Stephanie, these have been such great tools. So you've given us everything from things we can do individually in a self-reflective way to things that are actually, I mean, if nothing else, get someone to hold you accountable and go for a walk with someone, get your exercise and your outside time in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And don't feel guilty about taking care of yourself, right? Don't feel guilty about your physical health being a priority for you. I think that's a big takeaway, is that if we don't take care of ourselves, we can't take care of each other. And so it's so, so critically important to prioritize it.
I think that's the perfect one thing that really matters, because if we're not taking care of ourselves, we cannot, as you said, pour from an empty glass or overflow. I always like to think of my cup as overflowing, which is why I'm able to give. And that's so important. Is there anything else you want the listener to really cling on to before we say goodbye today?
No, I really think that covers it. I hope that that listeners will try the gratitude letter, especially. I have had people who've reconnected with people from their past who later passed away, and that was so deeply meaningful for both parties that if you do one thing, I would just encourage you to try that one.
I love it. That's so exciting. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really good chatting with you.
Okay, friends, what did you get out of that one? Are you ready for a self-compassion moment? Are you excited to do your gratitude journaling, which doesn't have to happen every day? I love that. Or what about your gratitude letter? Do you know who you're going to write it to? I'm just so excited to share this life with you. And I hope that these tried and true principles are giving you some ideas for how you can approach the next whatever part of your life, of your world, of your career. Because in case no one has told you today, you matter. We all know that music matters, especially how we teach it and how we share it and how we experience it. And I'll see you next time on the Music Ed Matters podcast.